Hello and welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Brian Nakata. I'm a marketing manager for Hyperproof, and I'm going to get us rolling. We're really excited to get to speak about a topic that many people are in our industry are currently facing or will experience at some point in their career, the transition from spreadsheets to a modern GRC tool. Our speakers today will be Thomas Wilcox, Hyperproof Senior Director of Security and Compliance at here, and then Elizabeth Matten, who is the Director of GRC at Demandbase. Thomas and Liz, can you give us a little bit more about your background and your experience?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks to everybody who's joining us today. I appreciate it. And I apologize in advance if I start to cut out due to some internet issues that I've been having. But yeah, I've been in the information security space for really over 25 years now. So that makes me an old man in the space. I come from a background of managing multiple compliance platforms. So I'm familiar with many frameworks and many of the pains I'm sure the folks are on the call have experienced. And certainly I've seen the maturation of the tool sets that we get to use in managing that burden, right? And Liz, I think you come from a background certainly where you have a lot of compliance experience as well.
Yeah, I have about 17 years, so not quite 25, but I definitely have done everything from building out entire programs in spreadsheets to building out entire programs using Jira and creating all these different types of Jira issues to using actual GRC tools. So I've kind of seen all the different flavors of how to try to run a program and organize a program.
Fantastic. Before I go over the agenda, I'd just like to start with some general housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box for our speakers to answer in the final 10 minutes of the event. If you happen to have any trouble with your audio or visuals during the event, please try to leave the webinar and come back. And if that doesn't work, please let us know in that Q&A box again, and we can try to troubleshoot. This webinar is being recorded for on demand, and you'll receive a link to that recording following the presentation. So you'll be able to watch longer through things if you'd like, or repeat, or review things as you like. Now, as for what we'll be touching on today, our speakers will begin by sharing the signs to look out for that can indicate it's time to upgrade to a tool from spreadsheets. Then they'll talk about the ways that they can best prepare for the transition, or that you can best prepare for the transition. And finally, they'll bring their experience to the table with some best practices on making a smooth transition and share some tips or mistakes that they might want you to know in advance. And with that, without further ado, I'll pass it to Thomas, who will get us going.
Awesome. So you should see a poll question pop up. Liz and I are very interested in starting to understand, the general consensus on the call of how folks have been managing their compliance burden to this point. If you've been in spreadsheets, we'd love to know, how big is that problem? Liz, when I think back, I probably had, 5 or 6 different programs at the height that I was managing at the same time. And for each one, I had a workbook. So for me to even tally up the number of spreadsheets, to me, that'd be a real challenge. It's a real burden when you're in spreadsheets, and these things just continue to grow and evolve and become their own individual animal. What's your experience?
Yeah, especially when you're starting to make that decision about, do I add more columns? Do I add a different tab? Do I archive this workbook for this year and create a new one? Like having to create an entire methodology around just managing your workbooks and how that changes over the years, and being able to know, okay, if I wanted this information for this previous year, I have to go look here because it's now in this like workbook number 20 or tab number 50. So it definitely can, as you grow, not just scaling wise, but also just in number of years, it gets really, really unmanageable.
Oh, clearly it's, when you're crossing controls across multiple frameworks, you're trying to do in a spreadsheet, let alone trying to track evidence, right? Where is my evidence? Where can I go to find it? What's my single source of truth? Those kind of questions, and you're trying to do all that in a spreadsheet. That's nearly impossible. You're going to struggle, and you're going to struggle mightily when it comes to, like authenticating that the information is still accurate. So yeah. Awesome.
And that's really important when you start thinking about reporting and transparency and how am I communicating this information? If you want to label a particular field across 3 different categories, like how are you doing that in a spreadsheet versus in a tool where you can just have 3 labels attached to one object? In a spreadsheet, it becomes much more complicated to be able to do that sort of slicing and dicing of data and reporting.
Yeah, so it feels like we've already answered the entire purpose of this call, this webinar, right? Spreadsheets are tough to manage. So awesome. Brian, hopefully we've had enough time to collect some answers.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. So we ended up with 16% of people saying 1, 25% 2 to 5, 33%, our largest demographic here, is 5+, and then we had about a quarter of people say other, but I haven't had anything sent yet in the chat to let us know what that might mean. So maybe they're just not particularly handling it themselves, or other reasons. But yeah, it looks like majority is between is 5+, and then we have another good percent in 2 to 5.
Awesome. Well, that's kind of what we expected to see. You're never going to decrease in the number of spreadsheets you're using. If you've been managing in spreadsheets, it's always going to increase. So anybody who's been doing this for a period of time, that evolution is probably turning into a big hairy monster. So that's great feedback. Thanks. That helps us position a little bit as we talk too. So, okay. So we're considering when you want to upgrade to a GRC tool, and Liz and I have been talking back and forth for the last couple of weeks about what are some of these items that are important. So let's dig in and understand what items are important. So if you look at the last decade, I would say, Liz, CISOs have come under additional pressures. They just seem to mount. We have an increasing attack surface, especially as we move to the cloud. We have ever creative attack actors out there. We also have this increasing burden called compliance. A lot of compliance is meant to meet those increasing challenges, but certainly we don't see budgets changing to meet that demand. And in this economy, where we have some downward pressure, we're certainly being asked from a resource perspective to do more with less. What's been your experience?
Yeah, definitely during budget and planning, some of what people would label as like, back office, or basically not customer facing roles, are not first in line when it comes for budget and headcount. And so I think that, we've learned kind of how to deal with this over the years. And as you've talked about, the current economy is putting even more pressure. As compliance grows, we know that compliance is an ever-changing environment. So you're not just dealing with do more with less, but in an ever-changing environment on top of it. And so I know we're going to talk a little bit about logistically how we do more with less, but like what I really also want to bring home is kind of not just how you do that logistically, but also how you're getting transparency, ownership, and engagement from your control owners, from your stakeholders, from your management, and how are you doing more with that with less. And so I think, when you start to have a tool, the benefit that I've seen is that your control owners are more engaged and they're starting to feel more ownership and asking more questions. And I'm just seeing like a real big uptick in engagement from my control owners, and that's giving them a different level of ownership of their responsibilities that they have. And then, logistically, we have the tool on top of that to help us track all of that as well.
Yeah, having the tool on top to track, that seems like a pretty simple statement, but in actuality, it's tracking a lot for you, right? So you're going to have a PM in a lot of instances that is managing your compliance audit program. So you have somebody who's coordinating all of the different pieces and the logistics. You want those people to be focused on the important things like the interface to external audit or internal audit, and making sure everybody's aligned on milestones and things like that. But the reality is, if you're in a spreadsheet world, they're just running down people to make sure that the items that are part and parcel to the review have been finished. So what you're going to do is you're going to free up a lot of the routine time that PMs have been spending, a lot of the mundane work that they're going to be doing, and allow them to focus on the more strategic work that is really important to the review. So to me, it doesn't replace a PM, but it certainly allows a PM to be used better and used in a way that is more appropriate for the ask of the audit.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think I've also lived in the environment where you don't have a PM. And I think having a tool carries a little bit of that PM lift for you as well. So no matter what environment you're in, if you have a PM, it's making your job easier. If you don't have a PM, it's also making the compliance manager's life easier because it's picking up some of that PM lift.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, make their life easier. They'll know quickly, just with a snapshot view, where they are in terms of an audit, in the health of it. Where are their controls sitting? Those kinds of things. Do I have evidence, and is it pertinent and timely, and those kinds of asks. So really, depending on the size of your program, you're going to get a different benefit out of it, but you're going to get a benefit no matter how small your program is out of a tool like this. Is that your experience?
Absolutely, I agree on that.
All right. All right, Brian, let's move on. So the next one, I'm going to tell you, especially when I was in a SOX world, all I did was struggle with audit. So, this one hits home for me. When you say struggling with an audit, you might be talking about something as simple as just getting all of the evidence organized in a way that you want to present it. It might be prior to the external audit, you're running around making sure the controls that you believe are in place are actually being accomplished the way you think they're being accomplished. So, in a bigger program, you also might have multiple audits that you're trying to get ready for, and each one of those creates its own struggle. Each one of those creates an environment that a tool can help with. Talk a little bit, because I know you have a lot of experience in audit. Talk a little bit about what your experience is.
Yeah, so I've definitely seen the benefit of having a GRC platform type tool. Whether you have a very simple program, you're not even to the point of a SOC 2 report and official external audit yet, but you're preparing for that all the way up to you're managing 5 or more different frameworks across different, data security, privacy, the whole range. And I think that when you look at the logistics of performing an audit, they're kind of similar no matter what situation you're in. Like you were talking about, you have to manage your control set, you have to manage all your ownership, like your asset inventory, essentially. Like, who are my control owners, my control performers? How do they roll up into the different organizations? How am I monitoring my controls in between the audits? It's the soup to nuts around your program. You feel a lot of pain around logistics and project management. And suddenly you're in this environment where it sounds like a lot of people on this call are in, where you've got 5+ more spreadsheets. And it's like you're trying to wrap your arms around multiple spreadsheets and that methodology of where do I go for the information that I need at this moment? How am I sending out requests and tracking requests? So it just becomes very unmanageable very quickly, whether you're at the point of I'm just introducing a compliance or GRC program and we're preparing to go for the real deal, or we're at the real deal and we have a ton of complexity.
Yeah. I like to summarize this as saying we've already gone through all of the work of compliance. The audit should be the victory lap, right? You should have it all organized and you should be able to present it. Unfortunately, when you're out of a spreadsheet, it's very difficult to get to that victory lap. If you have it all organized in one place and you have an easy ability to present audit back to whatever auditing entity is coming in, it really does become more of a victory lap. It's a nice place to be. Okay, Brian. All right, so you're adding additional frameworks. I like to think of this in simplistic terms, right? I live in a world of compliance every day. I understand my world. Suddenly the business says, we're going to do something different. And you realize that that's going to present a challenge to you from a compliance perspective. Probably the best example I can give is maybe you're a domestic provider. You're only in the United States today, but your business understands that you can gain market share by pushing into Europe or Latin America. And in that case, you might move from say a NIST centric controls environment to suddenly I have to have an ISO 27001 audit yearly done, or you might have SOC 2, but you need to do an ISO environment. So you're suddenly adding a burden of audit. And in that instance, you would like it to be easy. Sometimes it's not when you're in spreadsheets. What's been your experience?
I think that, we've talked about you're in this space where you have a ton of complexity, or in the future expect to soon have a ton of complexity. And that starts to introduce, how do you crosswalk the requirements in your control set so that you have the minimum amount of controls and you're not tracking a separate control set for each program. You're going to have crossover of requests. You're going to have crossover of your internal documentation about processes and where that applies to ISO versus SOC 2 versus GDPR. And so that's, you've already got the complexity that we've talked about, or the pain points within spreadsheets itself. And then you've now added this layer of how do I integrate all of that together? A lot of times we piggyback audits. So you do your SOC 2 and then immediately do your ISO so that you can leverage work performed in the SOC 2 for your ISO. How are you tracking that with your spreadsheet, where that overlap is, what's being transferred over? And so that's where a tool can really come in and help. And, as I mentioned previously, compliance is an ever-changing world. So we've got situations with like ISO where they just came out with their 2022 version of the framework that most people are using versus the 2013. And when you're in a spreadsheet world, having to do that gap assessment of, okay, here's my new set of requirements. What is brand new, what overlaps with the existing requirements, where do I have a gap in controls? Like having a tool that has the functionality, I think, and this is not a plug, but Hyperproof just came out with some functionality that kind of helps walk you through that process of doing that gap assessment and saying, okay, here's the new requirements, and helping you map your existing control set to them and doing that upgrade with a lot less work.
Yeah, I think you make a couple of really good points. One of them is you're going to have an environment where you have multiple frameworks where they don't necessarily talk the same language, and they don't necessarily go out of their way to make it easy for you to get from one place to the other. Certainly with even in the United States federal government, they can't get reciprocity in place between all of their frameworks, let alone doing it between all of the private frameworks that are out there in the federal government. So that's one thing that a tool set can really help with, is it's going to talk the language and help walk between different frameworks and make your control set applicable to multiple frameworks if you set it up correctly. And then to your point, if you're looking at Hyperproof, we have all that functionality built out for you, so you don't have to worry about walking it yourself and doing the gap analysis of new framework upgrades. We'll provide that to you. So great, Brian. All right, so you've decided to make a tool purchase. You've got to move forward. Now you have to really prepare your team for that transition, and there's some gotchas here. So this is an interesting one. We've talked about this a lot, Liz, and I think we think of this as a slightly different problem, each of us. So describe what you mean when you say change management and selling to others.
So, focusing on the sell others on the value, I think the hardest part that I have come up with being able to convince management and get buy-in that this tool is needed is that I don't have hard data to back up. This is how long I spend on requests, turnaround time, SLAs, because spreadsheets again are not giving you that data. So it's really hard to go the quantitative route of doing that. And so I really try to wrap it into where can I tell the story of the benefits across all of the different types of stakeholders, so that they're getting the picture of not just how is this making my life easier, but all of the different stakeholders as well.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. Where you focused immediately on how do I bring everybody at the top along, my mind went to, well, you're going to have all these detractors. So it shows us how we think differently. I think both ways are important, but it's been my experience. Anytime you make a change in an IT department, you're going to have pushback, whether it's in security, operations, help desk. If you change process, if you change tool set, you're going to have a detractor. And if you can identify those early and you can provide the thought leadership and the alignment to those folks early on, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache and time down the road. If you can align the value and even show them how it helps their particular job function, they're going to become a champion rather than being a detractor. And to me, that's critical.
Definitely. And I saw a question in the chat about kind of cyber risk and doing those assessments and how it ties to the controls. And Tom, I'll let you dive into the details of how Hyperproof can kind of help with that. But it's a good point I want to mention here that my personal experience is we've been using the Hyperproof risk module that helps you tie your risks to controls. And when your controls fail, it updates the health of your risk. And so that has been one of the story points of benefits that I'm able to go and talk to management about, and that they're starting to see the stakeholders of, okay, I have a place where I can see all my risks. I can see that they tie to these controls that I'm responsible for in my organization, the health of those controls, how much risk am I carrying, like the real-time impact of the control failures. And I think we all know that's kind of a hard picture to paint for stakeholders or organizational leaders when we are in spreadsheets and trying to say, you have these risks and they're tied to these controls. Like, it's a very manual walkthrough, but when you can get them into the tool and help really visualize it, like that is a benefit story point that we've really realized at our company.
Well, my network is acting up. I apologize if I'm cutting out on you.
We can hear you now.
Okay, good. I apologize. It's the internet gods are just on my side today.
All right. It looks like Thomas's internet might have dropped out there for a second. Liz, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide for you to start touching on, and we'll see if we can get Thomas back in.
Yeah, definitely. So we had, talked about how you're thinking about not just what the first framework you're going to implement, but, thinking ahead to what are the frameworks I'm going to implement. One of the things that I really tried to do is take a look at what framework would have the most coverage of control set across the future frameworks that I'm considering, so that I can build out my first master control set with a set of controls that, as I'm scaling and adding different frameworks to it, as I'm mapping those requirements, I'm not having to add as many controls. And I'm also writing my controls in a very generic way. Like, we're not talking about specific team names, specific titles, tool names, things like that, so that it's talking generically about what is the spirit of this control, so that it can map to requirements across different frameworks. So I think when you're picking that first framework, really thinking about what is not just the business is telling me this is the first thing that we want to go for. We want SOC 2 certification with, the security trust principle. It's, when you're trying to go implement your program, it's also thinking about when I'm setting it up in the GRC platform tool, what do I want to have down the line, and what pre-work do I want to do ahead of time as well.
That's great. And
I don't even know if I should talk. My internet's gotten so bad, so I apologize to everybody on this call. I'm going to join in when I see my connection stay strong.
Okay.
But Liz, the one question I would ask you is I know you've taken a pretty
I think he was getting into basically what I just talked about the master control set. And one thing that we talked about previously is like, how do we come up with figuring out what is that framework that's going to have that, best set of controls? And as an auditor, I'm a double, triple, quadruple check type of person. So I'm looking at multiple different frameworks, getting example control sets. Like in Hyperproof, you can upload your own controls, but they also have a example control set that says, if you're starting from scratch, here's the set of controls that we would recommend. And so I'm looking at that. I'm downloading SOC 2 reports or things from some of our top vendors or some of the AWS and GCP and saying, how are they doing their control language? And I really like to kind of, your control set is specific to your business. So I take all these different sources of information now that I've said kind of here's the framework I want to map it to. And then I'm picking and choosing the language and the type of controls that works for the business that I'm at now and putting that in as my master control set for the framework I've chosen that says like, this is going to have the most coverage now and down the line.
Awesome. So in some sense, you're looking for the tool that meets you where you are on your compliance journey, and you're not necessarily having to just stick your square peg in a round hole, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a really important consideration of, is the tool going to support the frameworks that I want to implement down the line? And is it going to support that lift when frameworks change? And so there's a lot of considerations there when picking the right platform for you.
Excellent. All right, Brian, I think we can move forward. So I know this is really close to your heart, Liz. You talk about data sources and some of the work that you do up front to organize it, organize your program appropriately so it enters into the platform better. When we talk about data set sources, are we talking about just GRC centric sources, or are there others?
I think data sources can mean multiple different things. So, we've got our main GRC data sources that we typically think about of, where do I pull my population, or where do I have technical controls that enforce approvals or access requests and things like that. But also really taking a look at your previous audits, or if you haven't done an audit yet, doing a deep dive into your processes, and at each part of the process where you're discussing what's going on, thinking about what tool is involved. What evidence would I show if I were doing the most thorough on the planet walkthrough end to end of everything had to be shown on a screen as I'm talking through this? That's really going to be your universe of tools. That's going to be your data input to this, not just the first ones that we think about.
Yeah, that's excellent. And then I'd like to point out, if you are going to go through that work, you might as well look and say, what tools give us the opportunity to automate evidence collection as we go through this journey, right? So understanding what your tool set from a GRC perspective is, and then understanding where those integrations might lie with that tool set, that's where you're going to save a bunch of time down the road. So get that right. Understand the primary source that auditors are going to respect and trust as an authenticated first line source, and then set up your automations, and you're gonna be in a much better position.
Yeah, and we had talked previously too about how that really goes into thinking when you're choosing what type of GRC tool, like what types of integrations am I going to need, both natively or like API wise support. So, taking that into consideration when you're documenting your data sources and saying, how am I ingesting this data and sending it back? Like, what platform is going to support the most integrations that I need out of this? And I think, Tom, you and I also talked previously a little bit about how before you would learn about change or data. Like I say, data sources means multiple things. Overhearing a conversation in the office or something like that. And we're in this brand new world where we're all remote and we're not overhearing those conversations or getting pulled into the conference room to have a quick chat about something. And so it's even more important and at this time to have that documentation of your data sources, of your environment, to really have a thorough understanding of where it's at today and talking to those stakeholders and figuring out what are their plans for it in the near future, so that you have to be very deliberate about getting that information and writing it down, because we don't have the same access to it as we did before.
Yeah, nothing derails a compliance program more than when you find out one of your primary sources has been changed without you being told, right? And I've actually experienced that. I experienced where an HR department had the power to completely change out their HR platform, and they never told us they were doing it. And we found out literally a couple weeks before audit was being performed. So we missed a bunch of audit checkpoints that we would have had. Now, we found out ahead, we can explain it, but still, you'd rather not find out that way, right? You'd rather find out through a very organized approach. So yeah, and when you can set up the automation, your automations are going to start to fail early on when they change a tool, and you're going to know that the health of that is in trouble very quickly. All right, Brian, we should probably move on. So you now have your team aligned. You're going through the transition. What are some gotchas that you need to know? And we thought we'd throw out 3 of them. So Liz, you're very passionate about this, and you definitely have more experience here than I do. But how you organize your data in the time you spend up front matters, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We've talked about just the, document your data sources, your ecosystem. This is really more about, I have this world and environment where I have information across multiple different spreadsheets. I now have this tool that has these different features and functionality that are going to help my program grow. And before just taking what you have now and putting it into the tool, really strategically thinking about, what do I want out of this tool? And based on that, what data and in what format am I going to upload it? It's easier to figure out, hey, because it has this reporting feature, I want to add this custom field, and it's going to be this, and having your information clean and organized right before you're bringing it into the tool, because I think, as they say, garbage in, garbage out type of a thing. So it's really being strategic about not just what data I have, which we talked about, but how do I want to use that data with this tool? And then what does that mean for how I format the data to get it into the tool? And there's certain tools that really help you out with that. Like Hyperproof has a bulk upload that you can do. Like if you already have a risk register somewhere in a spreadsheet, you can download an example CSV file where they give you kind of the format of how to do it. And you just take your existing spreadsheet, map it to that, and click some buttons, and it pulls it in. So I think also when you're choosing a GRC tool, looking at what is available in the platform to help make this more streamlined and more efficient.
Yeah. So you spoke about how important it is to you to have that kind of clean data set up front. But some people are living in an environment that's so hectic and so hard to organize that they're going to look at that and say, well, I can never get there. Is there still a benefit if you don't have the time to clean all that data up before you upload it?
Yeah, and I know this from experience, bringing in just the program as it is to a tool, and then kind of having the format and how we have the data in the tool change as we make those decisions along the line. Like I think in a lot of, if we're in a startup environment, or we're just in a lot of people are in a fast-paced environment, you don't have the time you always want to think about that strategic planning. And so it's get it in, and as we go along, let's figure it out and update it. And I want to say that that's okay too. The one thing you want to think about is, when you're evaluating GRC platforms, or which ones are giving me that flexibility So if I do decide down the line, hey, I need to add this data point across controls or across risks because now I want to do this type of reporting, how easy is it to do that and update it for previous controls that you had in there? And so just looking at the tool functionality of if I need to come in messy, can the tool be flexible enough to help me through that transition as I'm making frequent changes? Like we in our risk program, have certain labels for like what our risk scores are and just made decisions to kind of change wording to align with how other or teams are talking about risk. And in a tool, it was literally going into a setting and changing one thing, whereas in a spreadsheet, it would be going in and filtering to find those risks that had the old name and like renaming them and stuff. So you want a tool that's able to support that.
Yeah, I think the word that I would use is scalable, and I think we've used it before. But again, you want a tool that can scale with you, but it can also meet you where you're at today on your compliance journey and help you get where you want to go, right? I think those are great points. All right, Brian, we can move forward. So this is clearly my point because I've talked about it once already. But you are going to have in your organization blockers, and they're going to be folks that have consistently shown that they don't like to change, right? This is the way we've always done it. This is how I'm going to continue to do it. And I only have 5 years till I'm going to retire, right? It's that kind of mentality that you have to fight. So a couple tips that I would put out is identify those early and get them aligned. Get your executive team to communicate that this is a priority and this is why it's a priority. And certainly if you have some prioritization methodology inside your organization, make sure it clearly demonstrates that this tool set and this move is of strategic value to the organization. So if that's an OKR or something similar, I would recommend it. But the idea here is make the rationale so compelling from a leadership perspective that folks are going to look at being a detractor as probably a career-ending move. So Liz, what's your experience?
I definitely agree with that. And we talked earlier about stakeholders and understanding them. I think the important piece here is to, again, really think about every single stakeholder at every step along the way. We don't just have management and our control owners and our control performers. Sometimes we have that like one engineer who is the one that pulls the population of change management, even though they have nothing else to do with the change management process. They just are the person that you go to get that done. And so it's really identifying every single person that's involved in the step of the way. And I think this feels very obvious to say, but going out and talking to them, I think is an important point that is missed, and really saying like, what's your experience with us as we're doing this? What are your pain points? What do you like? And that not only gives you a set of requirements for what I need to look for in a GRC platform tool to be able to address that, but that gives you the information that you need as well to start painting that, user story, as I talked about, where you are selling the ROI on this of it's helping this person in this way and these type of people in this way. And you've really got multiple use cases to say, here's the entire book of chapters of how this is going to benefit the company.
No, that's great. There's a couple others that I would mention. One is if you bring training into the mix early on as well, and so you get people really familiar with the tool as it's being implemented, and certainly do it before they have to use it every day for their job. And then the other one I would mention is if you can align your external audit, that's going to be helpful as well, right? A lot of auditors are not going to be comfortable with the idea that they're using that. But once you get them to understand that, hey, this is the tool we choose, and perhaps you're even going to build out some language and contracts and things like that to force it, it's going to make your life a lot easier.
Yeah. And Tom, I liked how earlier you talked about, not just the different type of stakeholders, but kind of the prioritization. I definitely see that when you're getting buy-in from the people on the ground who are doing some of the more task and detailed work, and you're talking to them about their pain points and getting their buy-in, and then going up levels, it's kind of this like snowball of buy-in power. And suddenly management isn't just hearing from you that this is a tool that we need and here it is how it's going to help us, but we've got control owners across the company who are now like talking to their management about how GRC said maybe there's a tool that's going to make this easier. And so it's kind of spreading the word and they're hearing it from multiple sources.
Yeah, making a champion out of a former detractor. Yeah, I love that. All right, Brian, we can probably move on. So when I see the word data, I always going to think of you, Liz, because I think these are the items that you're really passionate about. But the idea here is if you put work up front into how you position your data, you're going to reap the benefits out the other end of it, right? It's the good data in, good data out, rather than bad data in, bad data out. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, we've touched on, not just documenting your data and your ecosystem, as well as strategically thinking about how am I going to use this tool and what does that mean for how I'm organizing my data, but also, really trying to be thoughtful about the one thing I've found with a lot of tools, whether it's a GRC tool or not, is your expectations do not always match reality. So finding a vendor that's going to work with you to kind of do that, hey, I want to play with the tool. I want to put some dummy data in there. I want to make sure that, what I'm putting in and what I think I'm going to get out of this tool actually hits the way that I want it to hit. And so that's something that if you are able to bake in that time, like that's being able to be very strategic about, using that as a part of the evaluation period as you're choosing a tool.
Yeah, and certainly you have a bunch of options with tools that may be just below the obvious surface, right? Custom fields and things like that may give you power that you don't understand day one how to use. So spending that time understanding how you might leverage those items and getting the best value out of the other end, that's worth the time if you can spend it. Again, if you can't spend it, you have the option and it's going to make your life easier just to upload. But if you have the time, you're going to reap some benefit out of it, aren't you?
Absolutely. And we talked about do more with less. I think one thing that's very important to think about when choosing what vendor you're going to partner with is if it's okay, I don't have the bandwidth or the time to be able to, set up this sandbox myself and put in the dummy data. The partnership that you're going to have with, whatever vendor you go with and what level of support they're going to give you is extremely important. Like that was one of my main drivers when picking a GRC tool was making sure that it was a vendor that I have a very small team, we have a very large scope. What level of partnership are they going to give me now to help me with implementation? But also, are they thinking about growing into the areas that I want to grow in as well that will support, the data that I'm trying to bring in. So I think when we originally went with Hyperproof, I don't think they had a risk module. And that was like a data set that I had. But, really and I'm not getting paid to say this, but really partnering with them and saying, hey, this is my vision of a GRC tool. This is what I'm trying to get out of it. Like, is that on your roadmap? Is that coming soon? Is that what you're doing? And it was like, yes, absolutely. Like very quickly, we had the risk module so we could have a risk register and start doing that. And so that's part of your decision process too, is like finding the right partner.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And, if you want me to slip a 20 under the door or something, just let me know. All right. Well, Brian, we should probably wrap up if we want to have some time for questions.
Yes. And some really great insight on today's presentation. So thank you to the both of you. We also appreciate our listeners' grace as we work through a couple internet hiccups along the way. As we near the end of the event, I thought we'd go over some key takeaways for our audience to remember. First, we kind of went over it's best to start by selling the value of the GRC platform to any stakeholders, but also begin thinking about the different ways that it'll benefit you as well and different reasons that it would make sense to move to one. Second, we considered which frameworks you'd want to implement first to save you time in the long run. And then lastly, how you should organize and set up your data, as it will be a major part of the transition. Thomas and Elizabeth, I'd love to pass it to you both before we go to questions. And if you do have questions, feel free to start writing those in the question Q&A box there. But Thomas and Elizabeth, I'd love to get some final thoughts for today or anything you might have to add.
Sure, I'll start. So for me, I like to summarize really this whole discussion as quality of life. And just like having good internet is a quality of life piece that that everybody wants to have, cutting out useless tasks in your daily work is a huge quality of life step up. You're probably in spreadsheets now. In private moments, you might call it spreadsheet hell. That's certainly what I called it when I'm managing 10 plus workbooks or different programs and different workbooks, each with multiple spreadsheets, me trying to track down, proof, and are my controls healthy? Are people following up with the items that they are supposed to follow up with? When I moved to the Hyperproof platform, which is a fairly new adoption even for me, the quality of life went way up for me. I'm doing more strategic thought, and I'm able to focus on the gaps that I want to close versus just following up on compliance and audit items, right? It's a huge quality of life. So if you're out there trying to understand what is one reason I might want to investigate this, take the quality of life plunge. You're not going to regret it.
I definitely agree with that. And I think, my big takeaway is really the precursor to that is know your story. And like I talked about, like really thinking through not just what we normally think about within the scope of our GRC program, but who are all the people, all the data, all the systems, consciously thinking about scalability, strategically planning, how am I going to do this if you're able to, and, where you don't have that bandwidth for all that strategic planning up front, choosing a tool that's going to grow with you, both the tool itself and the partnership in the vendor, so that you're able to kind of go and say, this is the benefit that I'm getting out of it. This is where it's going to take us. And here's how this tool and this vendor is going to support that. That's a great selling point to be able to get a platform and a tool.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Well, let's move into questions here. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box right now, and our speakers will definitely get to them. Before we get started, I also wanted to point out that there is a downloadable in the attachment section of the BrightTalk page that you're on with a PDF overview of some of the specific ways using Hyperproof would upgrade your workflows and also save you some time over spreadsheets. It has kind of a, here's what you're doing in spreadsheets versus here's what it looks like in Hyperproof. So a really great downloadable if you're interested in taking something with you from the webinar. And let's check to see questions here. It looks like we have one. Can Hyperproof currently integrate with other InfoSec tools like Tenable and Veracode? For example, ability to pull in vulnerabilities info from such tools and present in a risk view in Hyperproof?
The short answer is yes. I think there's over 70 hypersyncs now within Hyperproof, which means there's over 70 tools, and I know Tenable is one of them, that you can directly integrate with through the API infrastructure and pull all kinds of data that will act as proof. And then Hyperproof is built in such a way where all of the elements are relatable. So you can tie a risk, to a control or a plan of action, right? And what that creates is a very natural flow of the different work streams that are in your compliance program. So yeah, Liz, I'm going to let you chime in, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I think when you couple that with the automated testing features that we have as well, like when you have those hypersyncs, not just pulling in evidence, but also the automated control testing that's automatically updating your control health when it's flagging and saying, hey, this configuration has changed, or hey, we missed this SLA, or whatever automated testing we've set up. And then that is feeding down to, you've tied that control to a risk. And so now your risk health is saying, hey, I was a risk at this score, but now the control that was mitigating some of me is now failing. So now my health has degraded to this level. And so I love as a person who loves data and databases, the many-to-many object relationship and kind of how everything ties together and flows. And even when there isn't a native integration, the very easy ability to say, okay, the source tool has an API, Hyperproof has an API, like we are able to integrate it that way. And there's tons of great documentation that Hyperproof has around that to make that a pretty easy process to do as well.
Awesome.
Right, and it looks like we have another one here for it says, Elizabeth, what was the most painful part of using spreadsheets for you, and has it been solved by using a tool?
I think the most painful decision was always, do I start a new spreadsheet? Do I archive this spreadsheet? Do I add new tabs? Do I add new columns? Like that whole methodology of managing spreadsheets that I talked about. And so I think that, how I'm organizing currently isn't always how I'm going to organize in the future. So I would say yes, because in the spreadsheet world, if you change how you want to be organizing your data, you're having to redo everything in your spreadsheet or archive that spreadsheet and copy the data you still want into a new one and like start over. And when you have a GRC platform tool, it's giving you that flexibility to be able to change how you're organizing your data or displaying it or the relationships between the objects without having to layer that methodology decision on top of like, do I do a fresh start? Do I add columns? Do I add tabs? How am I going to change the formulas that I have in the spreadsheets to account for this new data point? Like that's really taken care for you by the tool.
Yeah, I love that. I'll add on that I always worried in spreadsheets about, two terms us information security people know well, and that's integrity and accuracy of data. I always worry about that in a spreadsheet because it's open to being fallible, right? People can change it. It's not a primary source. So you always worry about, is the backend source still accurate? All of that gets solved when you move to a GRC tool that integrates directly to the primary sources. So I don't worry about the integrity of the data that I'm looking at. And I certainly have more visibility than I had in a spreadsheet to what is healthy and what isn't.
Yeah. And I think we marked one question answered about the annual cyber risk assessment. I talked about the kind of engaging stakeholders piece of it, but Tom, can you talk more about how a GRC tool like Hyperproof can help with the actual risk assessment efforts?
Sure. So one thing, it can allow alignment up and down your organization in thinking about and building out your risk register, which I can tell you from experience that can be a difficult lift. And then again, your risk register in a tool like Hyperproof is relatable to different items that are in the actual operational control list in POAMs and things like that are in your compliance program in Hyperproof. So it gives you an opportunity to really have a full view of risk and provide that same view up and down the organization to whoever should see it. And just providing the visibility piece of it, I think most people could recognize that's been a difficult piece of our job for years. And anything that simplifies that is a benefit to us.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that, especially when you're talking about an enterprise risk program, looking at a tool that has the ability to have multiple risk registers so that you can say, here's my detailed risk register where I'm talking about the nitty-gritty risks in terms of cybersecurity, and being able to tag ones that say, and these rise up to the level that they need to be on my enterprise-wide risk register. And then we also, like using Hyperproof, have the ability to kind of track the life cycle of a risk in terms of status. So we're not just doing an annual assessment and getting, risks in that way, but the tool being able to give us the ability of anybody in the company being able to submit a risk and having it in the status of like a queue intake so that then the risk team can go take a look at it and say, oh, this is a duplicate. I'm going to mark it a duplicate and like archive it, or this is a new risk and it needs to go on this detailed risk register and blow up to my enterprise risk register. So I think it really gives you that flexibility. And I know they just introduced or introducing soon, sorry if I'm misstating, but the ability to send out risk surveys through the tool itself. So I think a lot of us who supplement, as we're doing annual risk assessment, we're doing it through multiple ways, interview, surveys, and you're doing it through like Google Forms or something, and then you're having to take that spreadsheet and do massaging of the data on it and stuff. But when you're able to have those surveys sent from the tool itself and it's bringing the data into your register, like that makes life so much easier as well.
Awesome. Well, I just want to go ahead and cut it off here because I know we have a couple more questions from people, but I really recommend that you reach out to Liz or Thomas directly. Their emails are up there. They're happy to answer your questions more thoroughly. We're just kind of out of time today. So just want to really thank you for joining us, both to our speakers and to our audience. You can also subscribe to the Hyperproof Bright Talk channel or follow us on social media to be updated on new webinars and best practices in the IT security compliance risk industry GRC space. And in addition, Thomas and Elizabeth are both on LinkedIn, have graciously offered to answer any more questions you might have for them there as well. So I just appreciate everyone for joining us, and hope you all have an amazing day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Everybody.